This is your PowerPoint for the overview of the periods in AP World History. Now, one of the big things we're really going to be focusing on is going to be this first theme, which is the question of how much nature influences humans or humans influence nature. Now, the way these PowerPoints are going to be set up, I'm going to be giving you some general ideas, some specific examples, then we're going to finish up with some takeaways or some really big ways to kind of bring all the material together and think about that material. So the four big periods in AP World History are classical, post-classical, modern nation states in the 20th century. The classical is the beginnings of human empires in which people settle down and they begin creating these small city-states and trading kingdoms that eventually consolidate together into much larger human empires. The post-classical age are large land-based empires that expand outwards through military force and trade. The modern nation state then comes up, and the nation state of the modern period is really one that trades with one another based upon information and a dissemination of technology. And then finally we get to this century, which really includes the 20th and 21st century, and that's where we see two major world wars and a huge economic crisis that would lead to the globalization of trade and information. So human origins. Humans began in Africa about 250,000 years ago. We think they lived in small hunting and gathering groups of about 20 to 30 people. And what's important about this is that we call these groups kinship groups, and here's why. Today we think of families more in what we call, especially in the United States, more in what we call nuclear families, meaning that there's a couple with children who live in a house. That's not the way we think of families in traditional societies or societies of human origins. We call them kinship relationships because what you would have is a man and a woman, you would have multiple children, and then you would have them living with an aunt or uncle, possibly multiple aunts and uncles, as well as grandparents, and they would all live together and support one another. Eventually, the Little Ice Age, major climatic change about 25,000 years ago, forced people out of Africa, and they began looking for warmer climates. So the very first human beings that settled down in what are known as sedentary societies, or small kingdoms or city-states in which they traded with one another. They tended to settle next to river systems that would help them to create an agricultural surplus. So next to these river systems, they would create irrigation systems, and they would use the river then to create agricultural surpluses. Now this demanded some way to manage these agricultural surpluses, and they did this through the development of bureaucracy. So they would create offices within their governments in order to manage irrigation projects and the production of food, as well as the protection of land and so forth. Now this brings up this issue then about nature and human beings. Sedentary societies really had a turning point with the creation of new technologies, and this new type of technology was created through a process called metallurgy. Metallurgy is when you bring together different minerals and you create a new type of metal. So we look at the two first big ones. These are human creations of iron and bronze. Now you might think, okay, iron and bronze probably used for military exploits, which actually is true. They were used for military exploits, but that wasn't their main purpose. Their main purpose really was to create surpluses of agriculture. So they used iron and bronze in order to create these surpluses, which then led into the domestication of animals like cattle, pigs, and horses. And you know, one of the big questions that comes out of this is, okay, well, why did it take humans so long to do these activities? Well, a possible explanation was the effect of the Ice Age. That the Ice Age forced people into moving out of these areas and then to look for sources of how they could support their population sizes. So nature is going to have different impacts upon societies in different areas, and a good example of this is what happens in the Americas. You know, the American societies, oftentimes there's this myth that American societies were about natives living in tribal regions, which, again, not entirely untrue. For example, when Christopher Columbus came to the Western Hemisphere, he settled on the island of Hispaniola and met a group of natives called the Arawak Indians. They fit into sort of like the stereotype. Small tribal groups, no wars, and they tended to survive very well. Now, why is that the case? Well, they were geographically isolated, being on an island. They had plenty of food sources for the size of their population, and there was no need for them to create anything larger than a tribe. Yet in other parts of the Americas, we have large nation-state kind of developments, even empires, like the Aztecs and the Incas, arising out of the original Toltecs and Olmecs. So what we do see within the Americas are a variety of different groups, yet there were some disadvantages in the natural resources of those areas. For one thing, natives within the Americas did not have cereal grains. Cereal grains were located in Africa and the Middle East, but not within the Americas. Also, they had a lack of what are called labor animals. Instead, they had pack animals. The best example of this was the llama. Now, why should you care about this? Why does this matter? Well, in the long term, one of the theories about why the Native Americans are going to eventually fall, especially in the interaction with the Europeans, is because they didn't have quite as much development, even though at this time period they were far more developed than the empires within Europe. Well, why is this the case? Well, very possibly that the types of food that was available, the lack of cereal grains within the Americas, just did not provide for the kind of nutrition that Europeans, Africans, and the Middle East were going to receive. Also, without labor animals, it was very hard to progress and form new types of technologies. So this brings up the big issue within this PowerPoint, and it's a theory known as geographical determinism. So the idea of geographical determinism is that nature determines what human beings do. Now, whenever you're approached with a theory like this, there are a few things I want you to consider. And this is true about world history in general. Whenever you're approached with something called a monocausal theory, meaning that there's one argument in history that gives us a single cause and single effects, I want you to be very skeptical. Human beings are far more complex than that. Usually there are multiple causes and multiple effects to anything that happens. So how do we organize all this together? Well, there are two ways that we tend to do this. It's something called overdetermination and the tipping point. Overdetermination is a theory that holds that multiple causes will eventually coalesce together into a threshold that leads to multiple effects. Well, what is that threshold? Well, that's the tipping point. A tipping point is when a major event throws us into causes. So, like, for example, what's the tipping point of this early period? Well, probably the tipping point is the creation of metallurgy. Metallurgy is really going to throw human beings into the ability to do everything from sedentary societies to irrigation projects, to domestication of animals, and so forth. But notice that the tipping point was not the only reason why we got there. We have the Little Ice Age, we have the movement of people out of Africa, we have the nomadic type of organization. I mean, there are a lot of causes here. What technology does is it becomes what we call the proximate cause that throws us into the next period. And this is going to bring up a really complex issue. It's going to be the issue of determinism versus free will and choice. So I'll give you a good example of how geographical determinism works. And this is possibly a very good example where it might be accurate. Let's take the Polynesians as a good example. The Polynesians were a group of people who moved out of Africa, down through the Middle East, down into Southeast Asia. And their ancestors lived within that area. Well, when the Little Ice Age took place, just as heating causes changes, so does cooling. And cooling in the earth led to changes with the coral reefs. The coral reefs began losing oxygen, and so they began dying off. The Polynesians then needed a food source, and so they left Southeast Asia. And they ended up finding better food sources everywhere from the Micronesian islands in Southeast Asia all the way out to Hawaii. Now, think about that for a moment. That's 310,000 square kilometers that they were able to go out from. And that's during a time period in which they had very little technology. So you might think, oh, okay, geographical determinism makes kind of sense to me, right? I mean, Polynesian example is a good example of that. Little Ice Age, lack of coral reefs, pushes people out to migration. I get it. Geographical determinism makes sense. One problem, though, to consider with that. If you believe in geographical determinism, you have to believe in the illusion of ideas, the illusion of choice. What determinism basically says is that human beings are objects, and they're pushed by their context. And there's a real problem with that, because that means that when we look at different ideas and different ideologies, all these ideologies are really, in essence, illusions of nature. Okay, like for example, when you wake up this morning, if it's cold outside, you put on a jacket, right? Well, you can say, well, I chose to put on the jacket. Not really. I mean, if we're really going to be honest, you were cold, you needed a way to protect yourself from the cold, so you put on a jacket. In the end, you really weren't making a choice. You were making what we call a forced choice. Okay, because of the cold, you needed a way to protect yourself, you put on a jacket. So if you believe in geographical determinism, then you have to buy into the fact that there is no such thing as free will or free choice. Well, that's kind of difficult. And the reason why it's difficult, of course, is because there's so many differences in the ideas and choices that human beings have made. So let's go through a few of these with some examples from classical empires. In the case of India, India started off with the Harappan farming groups. These were basically disconnected, sort of confederation of farming groups that were spread out all over India. There really was not any centralization. They were eventually invaded by the Aryans, an Indo-European group, so a group probably from Eastern European region, who came down into India and then eventually created a caste system, which was religiously justified but used for labor specialization and racial distinctions. Eventually, the caste system would eventually lead into a centralization of the Mauryan Empire, and their most famous leader being Ashoka. Now, Ashoka was originally a very brutal military leader who conquered most of the Indian region in northern India, but eventually he apologized for that and turned to the religion of Buddhism and believed he could unite people under a much more peaceful and trade-based set of belief systems. When he died, the Gupta Empire arose. They tried to centralize even further, but really failed. They ended up centralizing, but they had to cut back on the size of their Indian empire in order to do that. Now, what's important, let's go to the caste system for just a second, and this kind of demonstrates why we have to be careful with something like geographical determinism. You know, if you take a look at this, you're going to see some very specific choices that are being made here by the society. So this is a religiously justified caste system, and we'll talk more about the religious justification later this year, but notice who's in charge here and who's in the middle. So the Brahmins are in charge, they're priests. Under them, the Kshatriya, or the warriors, then the Vaishya, the merchants, and the Sudras, the commoners, and the untouchables, people who are sort of needing to be purified through this system. Now, look at what's important here. The Brahmins are in charge. The Brahmins are the priests. So this is a religiously based society. They've made that choice. Notice who's in the middle, the Vaishyas, the merchants. Well, why is that the case? Well, merchants are seen at this time period as sort of like a necessary evil. You have to have merchants because they keep the wealth going in society, but they're self-interested. Therefore, they are not interested in the common good. So notice some very specific choices are being made here, and we can see that represented within the religious hierarchy of the society. So within Greece, Greece was founded by the Mycenaeans, who migrated from Europe. One of the biggest problems the Greeks had was a lack of arable land, and this led into the creation on the Greek peninsula of city-states and what were called polis, or small city-states, dominated by wealthy landowners. Eventually, two major city-states are going to rise. There actually were thousands of these, but the two big ones that are going to rise are Sparta and Athens. Sparta would create a militaristic society. Athens created an aristocratic democracy. And as the two of them eventually came together to defeat the Persians, who tried to invade this huge land-based empire of Persia, they tried to invade into the area. Sparta and Athens would end up competing against each other, and when they did, that eventually would cause their decline, which led into probably the biggest Western empire of this time period, and that is Rome. Rome was initially created as a republic by the Etruscans in the mountains surrounding the Italian area. The major conflict, again, we're going to see this as a common theme here. The major conflict was between the wealthy landowning patricians and the poor plebeians, and their major conflict was over land and the scarcity of land. The solution was to expand, but this eventually created war with the northern African empire of Carthage. The Roman Senate would defeat Carthage in 3 wars, but in order to do that, they had to turn over power to the Roman generals, creating an empire. And then last off is China. China has numerous different dynasties at this beginning stage. The first one is possibly never really existed. They are a mythical dynasty called the Jia. They were the initial farming groups within China. They were eventually consolidated together through something called the Zhang dynasty with centralized power. But then their centralization of power created a rebellion. And the rebellion occurred in the Chu dynasty, which justified their rebellion as being under what's called the mandate of heaven. The mandate of heaven was that the emperor must rule justly or be overthrown. But eventually the Chu themselves would break down into what was known as the era of warring states, which took place for centuries, but eventually led to new ideas of governance. And the two big dynasties that are going to try and solve these problems of governance are the Qin and the Han. So the Qin was led by the Emperor Qin Shi Huang, and he believed in Chinese legalism, the idea or philosophy that stressed that absolute power should be in the emperor's hands in order to create social stability. The Han were led by Lao Bang. Lao Bang believed in Chinese Confucianism, the idea that there should be obligations between the classes and that society was almost like a huge family that had to work together through these obligations. The main problem, again, in China, like in these other societies, was a fight over the scarcity of land, and this took place between nobles and the emperor. Eventually, the Han tried to resolve this through a system called the Wellfield system, and I'm going to show that to you right now. You might get confused by this and think, oh, look at that, the emperor's land is so small, he must have not really been so important in this society, which makes sense looking at the picture. Actually, the emperor's land was considered to be sacred, even though it's the smallest amount of land. The noble's land, very large, the predominant amount of land, and the peasant's land on the ring on the edge. Now, what happened was this. The nobles had to have peasant labor to work on both nobles' land and the emperor's land to pay taxes to the system. The nobles' job but also was to protect the peasants and make sure the peasants had land to farm on in order to provide for themselves. This system then is a hierarchical system, but it's a system that provides for interconnection between the nobles, the peasants, and the emperor. Last off are the classical groups, the African groups. The African groups were impacted by the Little Ice Age. Probably the biggest group to be impacted were the Bantu tribes that existed in northern Western Africa. They would eventually end up, because of the Little Ice Age, they moved south into the east within Africa, and they ended up taking with them two things: iron and new languages, especially the Swahili languages. This led to settled trading cities on the East African coastline. And it created these what are called port cities, which became central to the trade along East Africa, the Middle East, and the Indian coastline, and a huge dispersion of ideas as well as goods and services. So what are the takeaways we can take from this broad span of time period? Well, first of all, human beings were dramatically impacted by nature. Due to climatic changes, human beings moved out of Africa. They established cities and kingdoms for trade. Eventually, governance and ideas would arise out of this need for irrigation projects and water and surpluses of food. The question is, really, is how much does nature change humans? Is it that nature determines what humans are doing, or do humans change nature itself? If you buy into that nature changes humans, if you're a geographical determinist, then you have to expect that we do not have any free choice. Our ideas are just illusions coming out of nature itself. If, on the other hand, you believe that human ideas change nature, then you believe that there is some element of free will and that we're having a huge impact on the way nature works.